Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the history of Catholicism in the United States with the moving into the decade of the 1860s. 1860 was an election year, and the Illinois Republican State Convention took place in Decatur, Illinois, on May 9th and 10th, 1860. Abraham Lincoln's supporters embellished his life his life story into a frontier success saga, adopting the label the rail candidate, referring to an early job splitting wood beams as the base for railway foundations. Alternatively, he was presented as the plain-talking, honest Abe, unpolished but trustworthy lawyer to hard-working families. And I say embellished, this is true. It was part of his life story, but it's politics. On May 18th, at the Republican National Convention held in Chicago, Lincoln won the nomination on the third ballot. He was running for the nomination against, and I should remember, the Republican Party is new. It just came into existence in 1854, just 6 years earlier, as a result of the Whig Party breakdown, as well as divisions within the Democrats, largely between North and South, over slavery. But there were also some Northern Democrats who were sympathetic to the South, not as far as breaking up the Union, but anyway. So this is new. He was running against, for the Republican nomination, one guy we've met already, William Henry Seward. We met him when he was governor of New York, and later he's going to serve Lincoln, even though he ran against Lincoln. He's going to serve Lincoln as Secretary of State. Another running for the nomination was Salmon Chase. He was a former governor of Ohio, and he also is going to serve Lincoln presently as the Secretary of Treasury. And then later in 1864, Lincoln appointed him as the 6th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. For the Vice President position, the convention nominated Hannibal Hamlin. He was a former Democratic governor of Maine, but had become a Republican. Lincoln's success depended that he was considered a moderate and something of an outsider. He had served in the House of Representatives years earlier, but other than that, had not been too deeply involved in the extremely bitter conflicts that we covered in the 1850s. He was working as a railroad attorney. He was also known to support the old Federalist and then the Whig, now collapsed Whig, parties, typical initiatives for internal improvement. He supported their policy on tariffs. As the slave interest, the Southern slave interest, as well as their Northern allies, tightened their grip, most Republicans agreed with Lincoln that the North was the aggrieved party, in the sense that it was the Southern slave interests that were causing all the problems that we covered in the previous videos in the 1850s. The Democrats were also running a candidate, and it turned out to be another person we've already met, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, whom Lincoln had run against. Douglas was already a senator, and Lincoln tried to challenge him for that seat. and lost. That was the background for the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And now Stephen Douglas was selected as the candidate for the Democrats, the Northern Democrats, and pro-union. Douglas was very pro-union. But remember, on the slavery issue, he favored popular sovereignty, meaning state, like the population of each state would decide. Delegates from 11 slave states walked out of the Democratic Convention at that point. They opposed, ironically, they opposed Douglas's position on popular sovereignty. And again, this is all back to the territories conquered from Mexico. Since the topography of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, was not conducive to large-scale plantations, the southern slave owners assumed that the populations of those states, if given the choice, would not vote for slavery. Anyway, so the Democrats ran Stephen Douglas as their candidate, and for vice president they ran John Breckinridge, who was a former senator from Kentucky. No, what am I saying? That's the thing. This is late at night. I'm making this. That's why I have all these lights on. My brain's not working. John Breckinridge had been a vice president. He was Buchanan's vice president. He was a former senator from Kentucky. Breckinridge was he was the incumbent vice president, the 14th vice president of the United States, and so the Southern Democrats that seceded from the Democratic Convention in opposition to Stephen Douglas ran John Breckinridge as another, so it split the Democratic vote. Prior to the Republican Convention, this is interesting. It's largely disappeared from history, but this is prior to the Republican Convention. Abraham Lincoln's campaign began cultivating a nationwide youth organization called the Wide Awakes. So now we have the woke, so there was the Wide Awakes. So the background. In early March of 1860, Lincoln spoke in Hartford, Connecticut. He spoke against the spread of slavery, and he advocated workers' rights, advocated for the right of workers to go on strike, even. And that was pretty fringe back then. Because it was just taken as axiomatic by many that labor unions were fronts for communist infiltration into countries. 5 store clerks in Hartford, Connecticut, who had started, they were Republican, members of the new Republican Party. They started a group called the Wide Awakes, and they formed a parade for Lincoln, and Lincoln was delighted. Apparently, he was surprised by it, but they had a torchlight escort for him back to his hotel after his speech, and that's where Lincoln's campaign made overtures to the Wide Awakes and formed an alliance with them during the election. And Lincoln's campaign made plans to develop the Wide Awakes throughout the country and use them to spearhead voter registration drives. Since the Wide Awakes were appealed to young people, I mean, not children, but people young but still old enough to vote. Members of the Wide Awakes were described in the New York Times newspaper as, quote, young men of character and energy, earnest in their Republican convictions and enthusiastic in prosecuting the canvas on which we have entered. In Chicago, on October 3rd, 1860, 10,000 wide awakes marched in a 3-mile procession during the Republican convention. The wide awakes developed their own uniform. It was they wore a cape, and they wore a black hat, and they carried torches, long torches, like 6-foot, like poles, and they were lit by whale oil containers. The activities of the wide awakes were conducted primarily in the evening because of their affinity for these torchlight marches in cities throughout the Northeast. And the wide awakes created a banner which had the image of a large eyeball, on it. So we're wide awake. You see, that's it. As Stephen Douglas and other candidates campaigned, Lincoln gave I can't say no speeches, but he did not make many speeches himself. Which is ironic because he's famous for his speeches, but in this particular election, he did not. He did not stump, as they'd say. Instead, relying on the enthusiasm of the party and the driving force of the slave issue, and the union issue, and the alienation that many felt, those who had abandoned the Democratic Party and the Whig Party and the Know-Nothing, and had abandoned the Know-Nothings completely, or many had abandoned the Know-Nothings because of the violence and all the riots that we covered in the 1850s. The new Republican Party and the Wide Awakes, their youth group, did much of the legwork in getting out the voter registration, and then encouraging, getting people to get the vote out on election day, and it succeeded. Produced majorities in the North, and produced abundance of campaign posters, leaflets, newspaper editorials, many of which have survived. They're in the Lincoln Library as well as the Library of Congress. Republican speakers, surrogates for Lincoln, focused first on the party platform, and then Lincoln's life story, emphasizing his childhood poverty. The goal was to demonstrate the power of free labor. So he supported labor rights, which allowed a common farm boy, as he was, to work his way to the top by his own efforts. And politics is politics, but this was true. Lincoln came from a poor family. He was born in Kentucky. His mother died when he was young, so then the family relocated. He did take any job he could. He would chop down trees and then cut them down into those beams that they used to make railroads. He actually did do that. He was a frontier lawyer, and he took a job on the river, did flatboat work, transporting on the Mississippi River. So that part where he did come from that, frontier pioneer, economically impoverished strata of society. The Republican Party's production of campaign literature dwarfed the opposition because they were divided. The opposition was divided. A Chicago Tribune writer produced a pamphlet that it was a campaign biography, essentially, that sold 250,000 copies. And remember, the country is much smaller then, so that's a lot. Though Lincoln did not make many public appearances during the campaign, in the run-up to the election, he did take an office in the Illinois state capitol and received many visitors. He also hired John Nicolay as his personal secretary, and Nicolay remained in that role throughout his presidency, and wrote and kept some historically significant records, and reconstructing all that, for historians, everything that happened during the election and the Civil War. On November 6, 1860, Lincoln was elected as the 16th president. He took office in the Illinois state capitol to deal with he was the He was elected 16th president. He was the first Republican president, and his victory was entirely due to his support in the North and the West. No ballots, like zero ballots were cast for him in 10 of the 15 southern states. 10 of those states did not cast a single ballot for him. And in the other 5 states where there were some votes for him, he won only 2 of the counties in all of the southern states. Lincoln received 1,866,452 votes. Now that was only 39.8% of the vote. But there were four running for president. There was Lincoln, there was Douglas, Breckinridge, and God, I just said it. Anyway. It really is too late. Anyway, there were 4 running for election, and as he received the most votes, so it's the Andrew Jackson versus Quincy Adams thing all over again, and he won. Lincoln won a plurality of the votes, and that was enough. He carried all the northern states plus California and Oregon. His victory in the Electoral College was decisive. He had 180 electoral votes against 123 for the other opponents. The South was outraged by his election, and in response, secessionists implemented plans to leave the Union before he took office in March of 1861. Remember, today, presidents are inaugurated in January, but then it was done later. It was done in March. So he was elected in November. The following month, December 24th, 1860, the secession of the states from the Union came apart. The Merchant Republic of the original Constitution, came apart. It began in South Carolina. They issued on Christmas Eve a document titled "A Declaration of the Immediate Causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal Union." This was 3 years after the Dred Scott decision and 1 year after the execution of John Brown. On the same day of South Carolina's declaration, the governor of Alabama, Andrew Moore, called for his state to send delegates to a convention in Montgomery, Alabama, to decide whether or not Alabama should remain in the Union. And they did not, and Montgomery turned out to be the first capital of the Confederacy. So Abraham Lincoln, president number 16 he was sworn in on March 4th, 1861, and remained president until his assassination on April 15th, 1865. He was born on February 12th, 1809, in Hardin County, Kentucky, into a family of pioneer farmers. They were subsistence log cabin farmers, meaning that even though Kentucky was a slave state, they were certainly not of the plantation-owning class. The family relocated to Indiana in 1816. His mother died prematurely 2 years later. Lincoln was an avid reader all of his life, but his family's poverty left his education largely in his own hands. As I said, he did any work he could get. He saved money to buy books, but could not afford to build up a library. So he'd buy a few, he'd read them obsessively till he had, completely internalized the content. Then he would sell them and buy a few more and do the same thing. His mind was open in a different way to the world when he worked for 2 years on the Mississippi River in the flatboat trade, just going up and down the river from Illinois to New Orleans. In 1831, Lincoln relocated to New Salem, Illinois. He For a time, he enlisted in the state militia, what we would now call the National Guard. He served as a captain in the militia during the Black Hawk War in 1832, after which he ran for and won election in the Illinois state legislature in 1834. He served 4 terms, aligned with the anti-slavery wing of the Whig Party. And the Whigs were the reimagined Federalist. So Lincoln always did, even though he was in multiple parties politically. From the beginning, he had that old Federalist ethos, the strong belief in the strong central government. Having seen the plantation South personally, he characterized slavery as based on quote, both injustice and bad policy. And another, he said, if slavery's not wrong, then nothing's wrong. He obtained a law license in 1836. He took a year off of his life for a torrid romance with Anne Rutledge. But she died prematurely. She died in 1837. And then he had to get back to life, so he set up a law practice in Springfield, Illinois. He courted Mary Todd. She was from a prominent family, certainly in social terms, far above, and economic terms, far above his family of origin. Nevertheless, married her. It was not an entirely peaceful courtship, and they actually had broken it off at one point, but they did marry in 1842. They had 4 sons, though only one of them survived to adulthood. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the Federal House of Representatives, representing Illinois. He was elected as a Whig. In the House, he opposed President Polk's war against Mexico, which we covered previously in the 1840s. He also promoted in the House what he believed would be a solution to the slave problem. So this is, 20 years before the Civil War. His solution was as follows: that the government would simply buy all the slaves, thereby giving financial compensation to the owners. And then the government would immediately free those slaves and outlaw slavery in the nation. So that, the slave owners couldn't say their property was stolen from them because they were compensated. But this didn't go anywhere because the Southern, the political establishment was drawn from the wealthy, and in the South, the wealthy meant the plantation owners. And they believed that without slaves, they would not be able to have their plantations, and would not be able to certainly not make as much money. That was probably an erroneous view. I mean, a slave work plantation requires slaves, but that's not the only way to have large-scale agriculture. I mean, it is possible to have large-scale agricultural production without slaves. So, but anyway, they believed that was, so they were operating out of that, and that's why his proposal didn't go anywhere. Interesting historical what if. What if there had been enough? Or say if the government had gone for the deal and had offered to overpay for the slaves. I mean, really make it, offer so much money that that the kind of money people would not walk away from, in order for them to sell their slaves, then accept that slavery would be outlawed. But it didn't happen. Lincoln was then disgusted. Did not have a good experience working in the House of Representatives, so he retired from politics in 1849, went back to practicing law, became a lawyer for the railroad companies. He made a lot of money doing that. He's, by all accounts, was a very good lawyer. Now, Mary Todd, who was, it's like she spent every penny that he made. And there was probably some mental issues with Mary Todd. I mean, even before. I mean, she ended up just completely, but that was after, 3 of her 4 sons died and her husband died, and the Civil War and all. And but even before that, she was kind of unstable. He was Lincoln was bestirred to return to politics in the next decade by the controversy over Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act. As we saw, he ran against but was defeated in the Senate election against Douglas in 1854. And Lincoln once again ran as a Whig. After which, Lincoln joined the newly formed abolitionist Republican Party in 1856. In 1858, he ran for the Senate again, but lost. In May of 1860, the Republicans nominated him as their presidential candidate. He secured victory, as we said, owing to the divided field of four candidates. His known opposition to slavery, even though he was not as extreme as many, but it was known that he opposed it, prompted the secession movement in the South. And then we'll see what happened. So we've already seen after he was elected, but before he was inaugurated, the first state, South Carolina, withdrew from the Union, and Alabama would also they would meet and would also withdraw. Let's see. Bringing us to 1861. So the Alabama Convention was called in December of 1860. So on January 7th, 1861, the convention opened. On January 11th, by a vote of 61 to 39, it passed the Alabama Ordinances of Secession, severing Alabama from the Union, only 42 years after it had joined it. I mean, think of that. There were people alive who remembered when Alabama was not a state. And now, they withdrew. In the same month, January 29th, 1861, Kansas was admitted to the Union as a state. So we spent a great deal of time in the 1850s about Kansas, but so now it's finally admitted as a state. So the territory that became the state of Kansas has the distinction of being the place of the proto-martyrdom within the borders of what became the United States. In 1540, the Spanish conquistador Francisco Vasquez de Coronado explored the region looking for gold. Franciscan missionaries accompanied the expedition. A group of Franciscans, led by Father Juan de Padilla, remained behind to preach the gospel among the tribe of the indigenous people called the Wichita. There, in 1541, a rival tribe, possibly Apache, attacked the Wichita, and Father Padilla was killed, making him the proto-martyr of what became the United States. By the mid-19th century, the region contained the descendants of French colonists, along with more recent German immigrants, and a substantial number of Catholic converts among the Native Americans, owing to the work of Mother Rose Duchesne and the Religious of the Sacred Heart, who set up schools among the Potawatomi Indians. When Pope Pius IX created the Diocese of Leavenworth in 1855, he appointed an immigrant Jesuit missionary as founding bishop. This guy was from Savoy. His name was Jean-Baptiste Miege, M-I-E-G-E. He had studied at Chambéry in his native Savoy, then went to Milan in Italy for a seminary, was recruited by the Jesuits, and finished his studies at what was called the Collegio Romano, the Roman College, now is the Gregorian University. was ordained a priest in 1847. 2 years later, in 1849, he became a missionary, went to the United States, initially working in the Diocese of St. Louis, Missouri, where he distinguished himself working with the indigenous tribes. It was from this work that he was called to be bishop. He was ordained apostolic vicar on March 25th, 1851, and in 1855 became the bishop, the ordinary bishop of this newly created diocese. So he was made bishop during Bleeding Kansas, while all that we covered in the last decade was going on. He resigned as bishop, or he resigned as bishop in 1879, returned to the Jesuit order as a teacher on the faculty of Woodstock College, Maryland, and he died there on July 21st, 1884. But it was in January 29th, 1861. It now becomes a state. Kansas was a state. As the Union was falling apart, the Confederate States of America, the CSA, as distinct from the USA, came into existence by agreement of its constituents on February 4th, 1861. The first 7 of what became 11 southern states united to form the Confederate States of America on that date, with its first capital at Montgomery, Alabama. So the states included South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Texas, and Louisiana. As its first president, turns out only president, the Confederacy elected a Mississippi senator named Jefferson Davis. So, let's All right, so you see, this is all in the South here, and for reference, let's see, right there is Washington, D.C., and then you see, I don't know if you could see that, in Washington, D.C., and then down here, I can't see, is Montgomery, Alabama, and then see Montgomery right there is the first capital of the Confederacy, and then it's later going to be moved to Richmond, Virginia. Which is also on the map right there. And then you see notice how close Richmond, Virginia is to Washington, D.C. The two capitals. So the Civil War began. Let's see, where are we? Oh yeah, here it is. Okay, the Civil War. Is it still going? Yeah. The Civil War. The Civil War began 2 months later. So the Confederacy voted itself into existence on February 4th, 1861. The Civil War began on April 12th, 1861, 2 months later, when Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter at the entrance to the Bay of Charleston, South Carolina, when the federal garrison there refused to recognize the right of South Carolina to demand their property back. And so, 85 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, the Union of States that formed the American Republic came to an end in a bloodbath that lasted from April 12, 1861, until April 9th, 1865. Now that date, April 9th, was when Robert E. Lee surrendered. It did not end the fighting, as we'll see when we get there. There were other units because of communication. I mean, there's no radios or so that there were people still fighting. Fighting continued a while longer, but April 9th is considered the end because Lee had the most cohesive, the largest, most cohesive of the units, and then he called on others to surrender, and even when some of his officers said, we could fight a guerrilla war, and just make it much harder for them, he said, no, that's it, we lost. He encouraged them to surrender. It was one of the reasons he was not put on trial for war crimes as some of the others were. Okay, so at issue number one was the authority of the states in relation to the federal government. Ambiguity existed because of contradictions within the text of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8. The enumerated powers. The Congress shall have the power to, and then it lists a series of powers. Power number 18 reads as follows: to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So 18 is the last of the powers. So it lists all of them, and then at the end it says this: to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying all of those others and foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. All right, so that pertains to the federal Congress, or the federal government. Whereas in the same document, the same Constitution, Amendment number 10 reads as follows, quote, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. So endless oceans of ink have been spilt writing about this, about the tension between those two sections, between power number 18, the necessary and proper clause, versus amendment number 10, the reserved to the states clause. The federal government, powers of the federal government, the central government versus the state government. And, of course, that's still with us, but that's one issue. Church teaching on this issue, on the morality of the contending claims of state versus federal authority, church teaching is completely silent on that, as it is a matter of positive law. Positive not in the sense of necessarily good, but posit in the sense of placed. So positive law are laws that are placed by us, by humans. So it's not divine law, not natural law. It's just positive law is just placed there. However, the church does have very clear teaching on the obligation of the faithful to obey just authority. To the extent that the constitutional ambiguity rendered the just authority unclear, Catholics had no guidance on the matter. So those who favored a strong federal government, and in 1861 that meant anti-slavery, could look to Article 1, Section 8, to the necessary and proper clause. Whereas those who favored states' rights, and in 1861 that meant pro-slavery, could refer to Amendment number 10. Say it's up to the states. And that was Stephen Douglas's position, that each state should decide whether it has slaves or not. Issue number 2, of course, is slavery, is the morality of permitting legalized slavery in a land claiming to be a democratic republic. Now, we've covered this many times throughout the course, starting first 4 sessions of the course. This playlist dealt with it, so I won't repeat all that here. Okay, so Fort Sumter, South Carolina. All right. Well, this map This map isn't detailed enough, so I mean you can't see the actual fort or where it is, but it's South Carolina is there, and it protected Charleston Bay. Strategically significant. So it was a federal base. But South Carolina, since it's seceded from the Union, and they're saying, okay, we're not part of the country anymore, so we want our property back, the property on which the fort sits. And Lincoln refused. So the Confederacy opened fire, and I'll go into some detail on that shortly, but I want to so how the Confederacy came together first. In response to Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for the formation of a force of 75,000 troops from the state militias, the National Guards. He wanted the states to contribute that and use them to recapture the federal base because the Confederacy took the base. And so that forced all the states to choose. Rather than take up arms against a fellow Southern state, 4 more states seceded and joined the Confederacy. So state number 8, as we already have 7 states, so now state number 8, Virginia. 9, Arkansas. 10, Tennessee. 11, North Carolina. Therefore, the adversaries in the Civil War consisted of 11 Confederate states against 23 states of the Federal Union. And that number grew to 25 before the war ended. 4 states that did have slavery did not join the Confederacy. Missouri, where this kind of all started, remember the Missouri Compromise back in 1820. Maryland, Kentucky, and Delaware had slavery but did not join the Confederacy. They call them the border states. That's the border between the Confederacy and the across there. I can't see. So you see from Missouri over the border states. All right. This numerical imbalance was the most obvious obstacle facing the Confederacy, as they were outnumbered. At its peak, after imposing conscription, the Union Army grew to 2.1 million men, while the Confederate Army never exceeded, even at its peak, more than 750,000 men. Added to this, the industrial capacity of the North. The Northern economy industrialized, whereas the South did not. The South was still an agrarian economy. So the factories to make the weapons, ammunition, other supplies, was far larger in the North than in the South. The Confederacy had hoped for foreign support because there were European countries whose economies were closely tied to the South through the cotton trade, most particularly England. And despite sympathy from many in England for the South, the British ultimately refused to form an alliance, owing to the success of the Union publicity campaign characterizing the Confederacy as a benighted land of oppression and tyranny. The Catholic clergy and hierarchy generally sided with their region, wherever they lived, either the Union or the Confederacy, with some exceptions, and I'll go into detail as the chronology proceeds. Okay. All right, so all this happens. March 4th, 1861, Lincoln is actually inaugurated as 16th president. And here's some excerpts from his first inaugural address delivered that day. So I'll skip the intro and then pick up, quote, Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and their personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. This is Lincoln speaking. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Those who nominated and elected me did so with full knowledge that I had made this and many similar declarations and had never recanted them. It is 72 years since the first inauguration of a president under our national Constitution. During that period, 15 different and greatly distinguished citizens have, in succession, administered the executive branch of the government. They have conducted it through many perils, and generally with great success. Yet, with all this scope of precedent, I now enter upon the same task for the brief constitutional term of 4 years, under great and peculiar difficulty. A disruption of the federal union, heretofore only menaced, is now formidably attempted. I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution of these United States, of the Constitution, the Union of these states, I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the Union of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination. Continue to execute all the express provisions of our national Constitution, and the Union will endure forever, it being impossible to destroy it, except by some action not provided for in the instrument itself. That there are persons, in one section or another, who seek to destroy the Union, at all events, and are glad of any pretext to do it, I will neither affirm nor deny. But if there be such, I need address no word to them. To those, however, who really love the Union, may I not speak? Before entering upon so grave a matter as the destruction of our national fabric, with all its benefits, its memories, and its hopes, would it not be wise to ascertain precisely why we do it? Will you hazard so desperate a step while there is any possibility that any portion of the ills you fly from have no real existence? Will you, while the certain ills you fly to are greater than all the real ones you fly from, will you risk the commission of so fearful a mistake? One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. The Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution and the law for the suppression of the foreign slave trade are each as well enforced, perhaps, as any law can ever be in a community where the moral sense of the people imperfectly supports the law itself. The great body of the people abide by the dry legal obligation in both cases, and a few break in each. This, I think, cannot be perfectly cured, and it would be worse in both cases after the separation of the sections than before. The foreign slave trade, now imperfectly suppressed, would be ultimately revived without restriction in one section, while fugitive slaves, now only partially surrendered, would not be surrendered at all by the other. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained it, must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely as they will be, by the better angels of our nature. So he gave that speech on March 4th, 1861, the next month. April 12th, 1861, Southern forces fired upon Fort Sumter. Okay, so here are the details. Fort Sumter was named after a Revolutionary War hero, General Thomas Sumter. Fort Sumter was built after the burning of Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. It was built on an artificial island in the middle of a channel that provides Charleston with a natural harbor. South Carolina had owned multiple forts on the harbor: Fort Moultrie, Castle Pinckney, Fort Johnson, and Fort Sumter, but ceded them, succeeded the three that were in existence, Moultrie, Castle Pinckney, and Johnson, ceded them to the Union, along with the site on which Fort Sumter was later built, ceded them to the federal government in 1805. And then Fort Sumter was built after 1814 on that. It was actually a little sandbar, and then they built it up, made it an island. On December 26, 1860, only 6 days after South Carolina seceded from the Union, a major in the U.S. Army, a former professor of artillery at West Point Military Academy, abandoned the indefensible Fort Moultrie of Charleston Bay and relocated Companies E and H of the 1st U.S. Artillery to Fort Sumter and decided to make a stand there. In a letter delivered on January 31st, 1861, the governor of South Carolina, Governor Pickens, demanded of President Buchanan that he surrender Fort Sumter. Okay, so I'll pause here. Now, you see the problem. Buchanan is lame duck. And everybody knows who the next president is because Lincoln was already elected in November. So he was elected in November, so in the beginning of November. So we have the rest of November, December, and now this is the end of January, January 31st. But Lincoln is not in office until we have then the February, and then at the beginning of March. So 4 entire months plus a little over 4 months, while Buchanan is still president, but knows he doesn't have another term. So Pickens is hoping, he's gambling, Governor Pickens is gambling that they can make the point that the state has a right to declare eminent domain and reclaim lands it had previously ceded to the federal government. Figuring Buchanan, what does he care? You know, he's not going to be president, so he can do it. He can do the deed, and that would set the legal precedent. So that was the gamble. But as it turned out, Buchanan didn't do anything either way because of he was a strict constructionist. So because of the ambiguity in the Constitution, there is no, in the Constitution, there is, as Lincoln pointed out in the first inaugural, there is no mechanism in the Constitution for a state to withdraw from the Union. Yet there is also no mechanism in the Constitution to prevent a state from withdrawing from the Union. So Buchanan just was supine. He felt that he couldn't do anything. So it went back and forth. Over the next few months, repeated calls for evacuation of Fort Sumter from the government of South Carolina were ignored. And the Confederacy, there's a Confederate brigadier general from Louisiana, actually right from here, Pierre Gaston Toussaint Beauregard, PGT Beauregard. He studied at West Point, and actually the commanding officer, the Union officer at Fort Sumter, Major Anderson, had been a teacher of Beauregard at West Point. And so when Beauregard comes with a Confederate, he demands from his old professor that he surrenders, and they met a few times to talk about this, and quite amicable before the universal carnage began. And Anderson said, "Well, I can't do that. The fort is not mine to surrender. It's a federal fort. So we'll see what happened." The Union attempted to, meaning the federal government, attempted to reinforce the garrison, but those attempts were repulsed on January 9th, 1861, when the first shots of the war were actually fired, not at Fort Sumter, but at the resupply attempt. It was fired by cadets from the Citadel, which is the state military academy, South Carolina. They fired on the Star of the West, which was a steamer hired to transport troops and supplies to Fort Sumter, but no one was killed, so it's not considered. The war is not considered to have begun on January 9th. Anderson informed Lincoln. Communications were allowed because the Confederacy was hoping that it would just be surrendered. So Anderson wrote to Lincoln, informed him of the situation. Lincoln was installed on March 4th, and then Anderson informed Lincoln of the situation. He said, I only have so much food left. Lincoln ordered a fleet under the command of Gustavus Fox to attempt entry into Charleston Harbor to supply Fort Sumter. By April 6th, the first ships began to set sail for their rendezvous outside of Charleston Bay to try to run it. The first ship to arrive was the Harriet Lane. It arrived in the evening of April 11th, 1861, which was a Thursday. On the same day, Beauregard sent 3 officers to demand surrender, demand that Anderson surrender the fort. Anderson declined. The next day, Friday, April 12th, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. They fired for 34 straight hours. Of course, Fort Sumter had very limited ammunition, so no attempt was made to return fire for more than 2 hours. Then about 7 a.m., Captain Abner Doubleday, the fort's second in command, was given permission to fire the Union's first shots of the war in defense. And the artillery continued all day, but the Union fired slower to conserve ammunition. On Saturday, April 13th, with no more ammunition left, Major Anderson felt honor was satisfied, as Lincoln had not ordered him to fight to the death, to fight to the last man, but he did fight to the last round. So then he surrendered and evacuated. Okay, so that was April 13th. 2 days later, April 15th, Lincoln issued a public declaration that an insurrection existed. So that's one of the reasons I read that section from the first inaugural. Lincoln did not believe it was existentially possible for a state to secede from the Union. So he did not recognize the Confederacy as a separate country, but rather that they were still part of the United States, just in a state of rebellion and insurrection. So he called for 75,000 militia from the states to stop the rebellion. And as we saw, as a result of that, 4 more states seceded from the Union. Lincoln responded on May 3rd with a call for an additional 43,000 volunteers to serve for 3 years to expand the size of the regular army. 2,400 named battles can be identified over the ensuing 4 years, claiming 620,000 lives as an aggregate. I'm adding both sides together. Throughout the critical period of the war, 1861 to 1863, there were 3 distinct campaigns always in progress. I say critical because in the first week of July 1863, there was a decisive battle on one side in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and coincidentally the same week on the other side in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And so after that, the Confederacy was largely on the defensive. But after that, there was really no chance the Confederacy could win. But before that, it was not that clear. So the let's see. What did I do? No, here it is. All right. So on this, first is the Atlantic side. So I showed you the other map how close Virginia and Richmond were. That was one campaign in the east. So second in the center, in the you see Tennessee. So this area here around Tennessee, and that's the center. And then in the western front, I mean, we normally, we don't think of this as the western United States now, but this was the western theater, was the Mississippi River, which New Orleans all the way up goes all the way up to Minnesota, but the fighting would be Missouri down to New Orleans. Those are the 3 theaters of the war. May 24th, 1861, Union forces crossed the Potomac River and occupied Arlington Heights. That was the Arlington, where the cemetery is now, Arlington Cemetery. That was the plantation of Robert E. Lee, who had been an officer in the Union Army, graduate of West Point. But he resigned his commission and decided to, once Lincoln called for, the militia, then he had to choose, and Virginia seceded. And Lee said something to the effect that a union that requires swords and bayonets to keep it intact has no charm for me, that he would return to his home state of Virginia. So Arlington was taken, as he was right across the river, and now it's a national cemetery. The next month, June 3rd, 1861, a skirmish occurred near Philippi in West Virginia, or Western Virginia. The state of West Virginia didn't exist yet. We're going to see how that happened shortly. The Philippi engagement was the first land battle, first clash, really, of Union and Confederate forces in the East. It's not really considered because Fort Sumter was a siege, and then the one that the most consider the first Bull Run or the first Manassas as the first battle, which took place the next month, July 21st, 1861. And this is another confusion for anyone reads about this. The battles are often have 2 names. Like Northern historians would call it one thing, and Southern historians would call it another. So this battle on July 21st is called alternatively the First Battle of Bull Run or the First Battle of Manassas. Manassas was a place, Manassas, Virginia, It was a railroad junction, what they're fighting over. The Union Army, under the command of General Irwin McDowell, initially succeeded in driving Confederate forces back, and the Confederates were led by the same Beauregard who opened fire on Fort Sumter. But the arrival of troops, of Confederate reinforcements under General Joseph E. Johnston, initiated a series of reverses that required McDowell's army to surrender. And these were, as they say, raw troops in the sense that they had not seen combat. So they panicked. Many of them panicked, and they retreated, hence Bull Run. They retreated back to the defenses of Washington, D.C. And another noteworthy officer at this battle who held out until reinforcements arrived was Thomas Jackson. He was a professor. He also was a West Point graduate. He was a professor at VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, and as a result of this, he got his nickname, Stonewall. So Stonewall Jackson. His actual name was Thomas Jackson. July 1861, in order to defend themselves against the Confederate threat from Northern Virginia, engineers created a series of earthworks, ramparts, levees, forts, engineered around Washington, D.C. To add protection. In addition to the active, they already had Fort Washington on the Potomac, but they added this. And that engineering would end up saving Washington, D.C. at least twice in the course of the war. August 10th, 1861, was the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri. So the initial fightings on the east coast, so now Missouri's on the other side, on the Mississippi River side of the theater, the Western Theater. There, the Union Army, under General Nathaniel Lyon, Lyon, attacked Confederate troops, which consisted of state militia, south of Springfield, Missouri. After a disastrous day that included the death of the Union general, Lyon died fighting. They were thrown back. The Confederates won the battle. This Confederate victory emphasized the strong Southern presence, the strong Confederate presence in Missouri, even though Missouri did not join the Confederacy. Nevertheless, they did have Confederate sympathizers there. Back in the East, August 28th and 29th, 1861, Fort Hatteras, which is on Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, fell to the Union this time. So the Union hit back. It fell to the Union Navy and Marines. And this was the first naval victory for the Union, and it began a series of a strategy, as the Navy developed a strategy to blockade the South. It would take a while for them to do it, but once they did, it worked. September 20th, 1861, Lexington, Missouri, fell to Confederate forces under Sterling Price. So that's in the West, so we go back and forth. October 21st, 1861, the Battle of Ball's Bluff, Virginia, so back in the East. Colonel Edward Baker, who had been a senator from Oregon and a friend of President Lincoln, volunteered. He led troops across the Potomac River, but was forced back to the river's edge. His back was to the river, so it was, tactically was maybe not the absolute worst tactical situation to be in, but it is pretty far down on that list. And he also fought to the death. He died fighting. And the survivors have retreated. So the Union withdrawal turned into another embarrassing, panicked retreat, running away, essentially. Not an orderly withdrawal, not an orderly retreat, but just running away. And many of the Union soldiers drowned while trying to cross the waters of the Potomac, which in October are pretty cold. It soon became apparent that the war was not going to find a swift resolution. Generally, Catholic clergy and laity sided with the region in which they lived, north or south. One example of the Southern Catholic perspective is found in the writings of the Bishop of Charleston, South Carolina, where the fighting started, the first state to secede. The bishop's name was Patrick Lynch, Lynch. He was an Irish immigrant priest, born in Ireland on March 10, 1817. 2 years later, his family fled to the United States, settling in South Carolina. He was ordained a priest for the Diocese of Charleston in 1840. He was appointed third Bishop of Charleston on December 11, 1857. He was ordained by Francis Kenrick, whom we met several times, had been Bishop of Philadelphia, but by this point he was the ranking prelate in the country. He was the Archbishop of Baltimore, the nation's first diocese. At the time Lynch was ordained Bishop of Charleston, the diocese included North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, as well as the islands, the Bahamas and Bermuda. On February 20th, I'm jumping the chronology here, but just see before I read an excerpt from his letters. Later in the war, February 20th, 1864, the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, even though he was not Catholic, appointed Lynch, a Catholic bishop, as a delegate from the Confederacy to the Holy See, which to try to get the Pope, some sympathy. We're going to read letters exchanged between Davis and the Pope. The Pope received Bishop Lynch only in his ecclesiastical capacity, not as a delegate of the Confederacy. Still, Lynch had left the country acting for the Confederacy, so he could not return to the United States without risking arrest. And he was not able to return until a pardon was secured for him through the efforts of a later Archbishop of Baltimore, Martin Spalding, who we'll meet later, probably not in this video, but in a later video. So with that background, on August 4th, 1861, Lynch wrote a letter to Dagger John, Bishop John Hughes of New York, that has survived. The letter read in part, quote, "Most Reverend Dear Sir, the mails are so completely paralyzed that it is hard to get a letter from outside the Confederacy. Papers are scarcely ever seen. That, however, Jefferson would think a blessing, on the ground that he who is simply ignorant is wiser than the one who believes error." This war generally dates from the bombardment of Fort Sumter. There we fired the first gun, and the responsibility is charged on us. But in reality, that responsibility falls on those who rendered the conflict unavoidable. The South, years ago, and 100 times, declared that the triumph of the abolition or anti-slavery policy would break up the Union. They were in earnest. When that party, appealing to the people on the Chicago platform, meaning the Republican anti-slavery platform, elected their candidate by every free state vote, South Carolina seceded, and the other states were preparing to do so. The Yankees, with an inconceivable blindness, have originated, fostered, and propagated a fanatical party spirit which has brought about a result foretold from the beginning, both North and South, as the inevitable consequence of its success. Taking up anti-slavery, making it a religious dogma, and carrying it into politics, they have broken up the Union. If there is to be fighting, let those who voted the black Republican ticket shoulder their musket and bear the responsibility. Let them not send Irishmen to fight in their stead, and then stand looking on at the conflict when, in their heart of hearts, they care little which of the combatants destroy the other. So that's a Southern perspective from an Irish immigrant. I keep that in mind. When Lincoln does the draft, many other Irish immigrants are going to riot. This isn't our problem. We just got here. Then you want us to go die for this? No. All right. 4 months later, 4 months after this letter was written, a new year opened, 1862, with the nation still divided and at war with itself. So we'll pause here, and we'll pick up in the next video with 1862. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.